I smiled as Professor Eleanor Wilson's hand trembled on the retirement papers. 20 years ago, she failed me with a smirk on her face, destroying my future with a single red F. She didn't recognize me now. How could she? I was just a broke, desperate student back then before I threw myself off the university bridge. Now, I'm Mia Chen, 38, billionaire CEO, and the woman who just bought Westlake University. The same woman who gets to decide whether her retirement package includes healthcare or not. Karma's a patient beast, Professor Wilson. And I've been so very patient in my second life. The fluorescent lights of the Westlake University library hummed, a dull counterpoint to the frantic scratching of my pen. 18. Just 18. And the weight of the world felt like it was pressing down on my narrow shoulders. This scholarship wasn't just a piece of paper, it was my lifeline. The only thing keeping me afloat in the prestigious and expensive waters of Westlake. My parents? They'd poured every last cent, every last drop of their dreams into getting me here. The thought of their faces, etched with hope and sacrifice, was a constant burning pressure behind my eyes. 3 jobs, that's what it took. Early mornings slinging coffee at the campus cafe, the smell of burnt beans clinging to my clothes. Lunch shifts wrestling with unruly photocopiers in the admin office, the drone of machinery a soundtrack to my exhaustion. Evenings when other students were at parties or buried in textbooks without the gnawing worry of next month's rent, I was stocking shelves at a dimly lit convenience store off campus, the silence broken only by the beep of the scanner and the occasional drunken slur. Books weren't a luxury. They were a battlefield, each one a victory hard won against an empty wallet. Housing was a cramped dorm room I shared with 2 other girls, the air thick with the scent of instant noodles and cheap perfume. It wasn't the dream, but it was a step towards it. Or so I thought. Professor Eleanor Wilson's advanced economics class. That was the final hurdle. The only course standing between me and the renewal of my scholarship. The irony wasn't lost on me. A class about economic theory holding the key to my own economic survival. I knew the material, cold. I'd devoured the textbook, spent countless nights poring over supply and demand curves until they danced behind my eyelids. I'd participated in class, offered insights, asked questions. But Professor Wilson, there was something in her gaze when it landed on me, a coolness, a dismissiveness that had nothing to do with my answers and everything to do with me. I couldn't pinpoint it. Was it my secondhand clothes? The way I sometimes stumbled over a word when I was tired? The fatigue of my multiple jobs a lead weight on my tongue? Or was it something deeper, something I couldn't see? Her classroom was always chilly, the air conditioner blasting even in the cooler months. Professor Wilson herself was a woman carved from ice, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin over her sharp cheekbones. Her lectures were precise, delivered in a monotone that brooked no argument, no warmth. She'd call on students, her eyes sweeping the room, and when they landed on me, there was a flicker, a barely perceptible tightening of her lips. I'd answer, my voice as steady as I could make it, and she'd nod, a curt, dismissive gesture before moving on. Never a word of praise, never an encouraging smile. Just that cool, appraising stare that made me feel like an insect under a microscope. The final exam loomed, a monstrous shadow. It wasn't just about a grade, it was about everything. My parents' sacrifices, my future, the fragile scaffolding of the life I was trying so desperately to build. I pushed down the tendrils of unease about Professor Wilson. I just had to focus. I had to know the material, and I did. I really, really did. As I walked into the examination hall, the silence was deafening, thick with the collective anxiety of hundreds of students. I found my seat, took a deep breath, and told myself, "You've got this, Mia. You have to." The email arrived on a gray Tuesday morning. The subject line, Advanced Economics, Final Grade. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I clicked it open, my breath catching in my throat, and there it was, a single, brutal letter glowing crimson on the screen. F, F, it didn't make sense. It couldn't be right. I'd replayed every question from the exam in my mind, a torturous loop. I knew my answers had been solid, not just passing, but good. An F was impossible. It was a death sentence for my scholarship. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed its way up my throat. I had to talk to her. There had to be a mistake, a clerical error, something, anything but this. Professor Wilson's office hours were notoriously brief. I practically ran across campus, the damning F burning a hole in my vision. I found her office, the door slightly ajar. I knocked, my knuckles trembling. Enter. Her voice was as crisp and cold as ever. I pushed the door open. She was sitting behind her large mahogany desk, a landscape of neatly stacked papers and academic journals. She looked up, her expression unreadable, those pale eyes fixing on me. "Miss Chen," she said, no surprise in her tone, as if she'd been expecting me. "Professor Wilson," I stammered, my carefully prepared speech deserting me. My grade, for the final. It says I received an F." She consulted a folder on her desk, her movements deliberate, unhurried. That is correct." "But how?" My voice was small, desperate. "I don't understand. I studied so hard. I knew the material. Could there have been a mistake? Could you perhaps look at my paper again? Show me where I went wrong." A thin, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corners of her lips. It was there and gone in an instant, but I saw it. It was the smirk of someone who held all the cards, someone who enjoyed the power they wielded. "Miss Chen," she said, her voice laced with a condescending pity that was worse than outright anger. "The grading was quite thorough. Some people simply aren't cut out for the rigors of academia. Perhaps you should consider something less ambitious." Less ambitious. The words were a slap in the face. My parents' faces flashed before my eyes. Their pride, their hope, the countless hours I'd worked, the sacrifices I'd made. All of it dismissed with a casual, cruel wave of her hand. "But I need that scholarship, Professor," I pleaded, the fight draining out of me, replaced by a sickening wave of despair. "Without it, I can't stay at Westlake." She leaned back in her chair, the picture of academic indifference. "That is unfortunate. But university is a competitive environment. Not everyone is destined to succeed here." There was something more to it. I could feel it. This wasn't just about my exam paper. This was personal. But why? What had I ever done to her? Days later, the news filtered through the campus grapevine, a cruel twist of the knife. Professor Wilson's daughter, a girl named Clara, notoriously average in her studies but well-connected, had just secured the prestigious internship at Sterling and Finch. The very same internship I had poured my heart and soul into applying for, the one that my academic advisor had said I was a shoo-in for if I maintained my scholarship. The internship that required a recommendation from a senior faculty member in the economics department. A recommendation Professor Wilson would have been in a prime position to influence or withhold. The pieces clicked into place, a horrifying, sickening mosaic. My F. The internship. Clara, it wasn't about my academic ability, it was about clearing the path for her daughter. My future had been a casualty, a piece of collateral damage in Professor Wilson's game of maternal ambition. The coldness in her eyes hadn't been academic rigor. It had been the chilling focus of a predator. And I had been the prey. The red F wasn't just a letter, it was a brand, searing itself into my mind. My scholarship was gone, just like that. The official letter from the university administration was impersonal, concise, regret to inform, financial obligations, withdrawal procedures. Each word a nail in the coffin of my dreams. I couldn't bring myself to call my parents. How could I tell them? How could I explain that all their sacrifices, all their hard-earned money, all their hopes for me had amounted to this? Failure. The word echoed in the empty spaces of my dorm room, which would soon no longer be mine. Eviction notice. Another piece of paper dictating the sudden, brutal unraveling of my life. My roommate, Sarah, who had always been a source of quiet support, started to avoid my gaze. The pity in her eyes was almost unbearable. Then came the final blow, the one that shattered the last vestiges of my naivete. The internship at Sterling and Finch, the one I'd pinned so many hopes on, the one Professor Wilson's daughter Clara had so conveniently snagged. I found out that my supposed best friend, Chloe, The one I'd shared late night study sessions with, complained about professors with, dreamed about the future with, had also applied. And after I lost my scholarship and was no longer a viable candidate, Chloe had quietly accepted a secondary position they'd offered her there. She hadn't even told me. I saw her in the cafeteria, celebrating with a group of friends, her laughter echoing like a betrayal. She'd known how much it meant to me. She'd seen me crumble. And she'd stepped right over my ruins. The world turned gray. A heavy, suffocating blanket of depression settled over me. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of despair. Sleep offered no escape, only a brief respite before the crushing weight of reality returned. Food tasted like ash. The vibrant energy of the Westlake campus, once a source of inspiration, now felt like a cruel mockery. Every smiling face, every earnest discussion, every hopeful student striding purposefully towards their future was a reminder of everything I had lost. One night, the despair became a physical ache, a hollow emptiness that I couldn't bear. I found a half-empty bottle of cheap vodka under Sarah's bed. She'd been a bit of a party girl. I didn't even like the taste, but I drank. And drank. The burning liquid seared my throat, but it numbed the pain just a little. It blurred the sharp edges of my reality. The campus was dark, deserted. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of city traffic. I walked, aimlessly at first, the alcohol making my steps unsteady. My feet, seemingly with a will of their own, carried me towards the university bridge. It arched gracefully over the dark, swirling waters of the river, a landmark of the campus, a place where students often gathered to watch the sunset. Tonight, it looked different, ominous. I stood at the railing, the cold metal biting into my hands. The water below looked black, bottomless. An escape. An end to the pain, the disappointment, the suffocating weight of failure. My parents' faces flickered in my mind, a brief, agonizing stab of guilt. But the despair was stronger. It whispered insidious promises of peace, of oblivion. Some people simply aren't cut out for academia. Professor Wilson's words, perhaps try something less ambitious. The wind whipped my hair around my face, cold and biting. I closed my eyes, took a shaky breath, and leaned forward. The fall was a rush of wind, a sickening lurch in my stomach. Then, impact. A blinding flash of pain, and then darkness, utter, complete darkness. Beep, beep, beep. The rhythmic sound pierced through the thick fog in my head. Pain. A dull, throbbing ache that seemed to radiate from every inch of my body. I tried to open my eyes, but my eyelids felt like lead weights. Slowly, painstakingly, I managed to slit. Blurry shapes, white, the sterile smell of antiseptic. A hospital. Mia! Oh, Mia, thank God! Doctor, she's awake! Mom's voice, thick with tears, choked with relief. I felt her hand, warm and trembling on mine. Dad was there too, his face a mask of worry and exhaustion, his eyes red-rimmed. Sweetheart, he whispered, his voice rough. You're going to be okay. You're safe now. Safe? What had happened? The bridge, the fall, the darkness? I was alive? It didn't seem possible. I remembered the impact, the certainty of the end. Confusion swirled. Had I survived? How? The memories were fragmented, terrifying. Severe injuries. A doctor's voice murmured from somewhere beyond my vision. Multiple fractures. A long road to recovery. Days bled into weeks. The initial haze of pain and medication slowly began to lift. I pieced together the story from hushed conversations, from the pitying glances of nurses. A passing security guard had seen me fall. The emergency response had been swift. Miraculously, I had survived. Though survived, felt like an overstatement for the broken, battered thing I was. But then, little things started to feel off. Not just the disorientation of a near-death experience. Something more profound. One morning, a nurse bustled in to change the calendar on the wall. I watched her idly, my eyes focusing on the large, bold numbers. My blood ran cold. The year, it wasn't right. It read 2005. Impossible. I'd jumped in 2005, yes, but I'd lived through that year, gone on to... Wait. The memories of a future, a life beyond that fall, were vivid, terrifyingly real. The struggles, the eventual success, the planning, it all felt like it had happened. Had I dreamt it all? Was this some elaborate, pain induced hallucination? But the calendar was insistent. 2005. My parents looked younger, the lines of worry on their faces etched by my current crisis, not by years of watching me build an empire. The news on the small television in my room spoke of events from that year, things I dimly recalled from before. A newspaper left on my bedside table. The headline screamed of a world I had supposedly just left, yet also a world whose future I knew intimately. It was too much, too strange. I was 18 again. The fall hadn't just been survived, it had somehow reset things. Or had it? Was this a dream? A coma-induced fantasy? No, the pain was too real. The concern in my parents' eyes too genuine. The details too precise. One afternoon, alone in my room, the sun streaming through the window, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, more shocking than the fall itself. This wasn't just survival. This wasn't a hallucination. This was a second chance. I had been given another life. The knowledge of my first failed life and the subsequent hard-won phantom success, it was all there, locked away in my mind. A future I had already lived, a path I now knew intimately. The implications were staggering, terrifying, and exhilarating. The sterile white walls of the hospital room became my thinking chamber. Days stretched into weeks, filled with painful physical therapy, the mending of broken bones, and the slow, agonizing return of strength. But while my body healed, my mind raced. The memories of my future, that other life I'd somehow lived and lost, were not fading. They were crystal clear, a complete roadmap of the next 20 years. Stock market surges and crashes, the rise of tech giants from obscure startups, fashion trends that would take the world by storm, political shifts, business opportunities that had made others and eventually me billionaires. It was an almost unbearable weight, this knowledge, like holding the winning lottery numbers before the draw. What was I supposed to do with it? The initial raw instinct was to go back to Westlake, to confront Professor Wilson, to expose her, to fight. But the Mia of this second life, the one lying in this hospital bed, was still weak, still vulnerable. And the Mia who remembered the future knew that a direct confrontation, as a broke and discredited student, would be futile. They hadn't believed me then, in that other life. Why would they believe me now? The system was designed to protect its own. No. A different plan began to form, a seed of an idea taking root in the fertile ground of my future knowledge. Revenge was a part of it, yes. A cold, hard knot of it still sat in my chest whenever I thought of Wilson's smirk, her dismissive words. But it was more than just revenge now. It was about justice. Not just for me, but for all the others she had undoubtedly crushed. And it was about power. The power to ensure that people like Eleanor Wilson could never again destroy a life with impunity. I wouldn't fight her now, not directly. I would withdraw from Westlake University. My parents would be heartbroken, confused. But I would convince them. I needed time to heal, I'd say. Time to reassess. And then I would use my knowledge. Every stock tip, every business trend, every technological advance I remembered, I would leverage it. I would build wealth. Not just a comfortable life, but an empire. The kind of wealth that whispered, that commanded, that could buy and sell institutions like Westlake if it chose to. The ultimate justice wouldn't be just passing her class, or even exposing her. It would be controlling her fate. It would be returning to Westlake not as a desperate student, but as the one who signed the paychecks, the one who held the power. Lying there, a faint, determined smile touched my lips. It was a crazy plan. Audacious, almost impossible. But I had something no one else did. A 20-year head start on the future. This time, I whispered to the empty room, my voice hoarse but firm. I won't just try to pass her class. I'll let her fail me again. And then I'll own her career. The decision solidified. The path ahead was daunting, but for the first time since the fall, a sense of purpose, cold and sharp and exhilarating, coursed through me. The first life had been about survival. This second one would be about retribution. And then, perhaps, redemption. But first, power. Convincing my parents was harder than I expected. Withdraw from Westlake? Mia, are you sure? After everything? Mom's eyes welled up, her voice laced with a gentle confusion that tore at me. Dad just looked older, the hope he'd held for me dimming in his gaze. I need time to recover, Mom, Dad, I argued, trying to keep the tremor from my voice. Physically, yes, but mentally too. That place, Professor Wilson, it broke something in me. A gap year, that's all, to get strong again, to think about what I really want. It wasn't entirely a lie. The trauma was real, even if my plans were far beyond just getting strong. Reluctantly, they agreed. They saw the lingering shadows in my eyes, the way my hands still sometimes shook. They just wanted their daughter back, whole and healthy. The small savings I had, a couple of $1,000s eked out from those grueling part-time jobs in my first life, became my seed capital. It felt like a pittance, especially knowing the millions, the billions that were waiting to be made. But everyone starts somewhere. My future memories were a goldmine. I knew exactly which obscure tech startups were about to explode, which dot-com bubbles were about to burst, and which ones would weather the storm and soar. My first few investments were cautious, made from the battered laptop in my childhood bedroom, my fingers flying across the keyboard with a confidence that belied my 18-year-old frame. I remembered the buzz around a small, unheard-of company called, well, let's just say it involved fruit and computers, and another that was about to revolutionize online book sales, and then, well, everything else. While my body continued its slow mend, I started a small online business. I remembered the exact moment a certain type of kitschy retro phone accessory would become a massive, albeit short-lived trend. I sourced them cheaply from a supplier I knew would exist in a few months, set up a simple website, something I'd learned to do in my other future, and waited. The first sale felt like a miracle, then another, and another. It wasn't life-changing money, not yet, but it was proof. Proof that my knowledge was real, actionable. Balancing recovery with the burgeoning demands of my fledgling ventures was a struggle. There were days when the pain was a heavy cloak, when the memories of the fall, the darkness, threatened to pull me under. But the burning desire for justice, for the future I was meticulously planning, was a powerful antidote. Then came the first real taste of success. An emerging tech company, one I knew from my previous life would be bought out by a major player for a ludicrous sum. I poured every penny I'd made from the online business, every dime from my initial small stock gains, a total of $2,000 that felt like a king's ransom, into their undervalued shares. I watched the stock ticker like a hawk, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Then the news broke. Acquisition. The stock price skyrocketed. My $2,000 turned into $50,000 overnight. I stared at the number on my screen, a hysterical laugh bubbling up. It was working. It was really, truly working. The money was a tool, a means to an end. But something else started to happen, something unexpected. As I navigated this new old world, I encountered other students, bright, ambitious, but struggling. Students like the Mia I had once been, scraping by, overlooked, on the verge of giving up. I found myself offering advice, a little bit of capital here and there, a connection I knew would be valuable. I remembered the sting of being dismissed, the crushing weight of having no one believe in you. I couldn't save everyone, but I could help some. It wasn't part of the grand plan for revenge, not initially, but it felt right. A small way to counterbalance the darkness I was letting fester inside me regarding Wilson. This was just the beginning. 50,000 was a stepping stone. My vision was so much bigger. But as I closed my laptop that night, the glow of the screen illuminating my determined face, I knew one thing for sure. Mia Chen was back in the game, and this time she was playing to win. Big, 5 years. It felt like a lifetime, and yet like a blink. I was 23, but inside I carried the accumulated experience, the shrewdness of a woman much older. A woman who had already navigated the treacherous currents of the business world once before. Mia Vision Enterprises, that's what I called it. It started small, a tech company built on the foundations of my future knowledge, focusing on software and innovations I knew would be in high demand. It was respectable now, a mid-sized player making waves, but in my mind, it was already a giant. Mia, the quarterly reports are looking exceptional, David, my COO, said, sliding a sleek tablet across my minimalist office desk. He was young, brilliant, someone who'd been repeatedly passed over at his previous stuffier firm because he didn't fit their corporate mold. I'd seen his potential immediately. My team was full of people like David Diamonds in the rough, overlooked talents I'd specifically sought out. They were loyal, fiercely intelligent, and they believed in Mia Vision. They didn't know my secret, of course. They just thought I had an uncanny knack for predicting market trends. Good, I said, scanning the figures. But we can't get complacent. What's the status on the new AI integration for the logistics platform? Ahead of schedule, the beta testers are raving. I nodded, tough but fair. That was the reputation I was cultivating. I demanded excellence, pushed my teams hard, but I also rewarded them generously, fostered an environment of innovation, and always listened. I remembered too well what it felt like to be unheard. The path wasn't always smooth. My first real setback came like a punch to the gut. I'd trusted a partner, a charismatic entrepreneur named Julian, with a new division we were launching, a cutting-edge renewable energy venture I knew was a decade ahead of its time, but poised for explosive growth. He was charming, persuasive, and had a Rolodex that was supposedly golden. He also had a talent for siphoning funds into offshore accounts. Julian's disappeared. Sarah, my head of finance and one of my earliest hires, told me, her face pale. And so has most of the seed money for the green tech division. Betrayal. It was a familiar, bitter taste. The division was nearly destroyed before it even got off the ground. We salvaged what we could, but the loss was significant, not just financially, but in morale. It was a harsh lesson, a reminder that even with my future knowledge, human greed and duplicity were timeless constants. Trust, but verify. And then verify again. I implemented stricter protocols, more rigorous oversight. The kind of measures that the trusting, naive Mia of my first life would never have thought of. The kind of measures the Mia of this life now knew were essential for survival, for success. Mia Vision recovered, stronger, leaner, more resilient. Each challenge, each victory was a step closer to my ultimate goal. Professor Wilson was a distant memory most days, a ghost from a past I was rapidly outgrowing in every way but one, the cold, hard core of my ultimate plan. Westlake University. It loomed in the back of my mind, not as a place of education, but as a target. An acquisition. 10 years. A full decade since I'd woken up in that hospital bed, reborn into my own past. I was 28 now, and the name Mia Chen was synonymous with innovation, disruption, and a rapidly growing fortune. Maya Vision Enterprises wasn't just a mid-sized tech company anymore. It was a force to be reckoned in multiple sectors. AI, sustainable energy, even a burgeoning media wing that was challenging the old guard. My wealth was substantial, far beyond what my 18-year-old self could have ever imagined, even in her wildest scholarship-fueled dreams. Competing with major corporations became the norm. Their CEOs were older, mostly men, who initially dismissed me as a flash in the pan, a lucky young woman who'd gotten a few things right. They soon learned otherwise. My innovative approach, often guided by my knowledge of what would work because it had worked in that other future, consistently outmaneuvered them. I wasn't just predicting trends, I was setting them, years ahead of the curve. This kind of disruption doesn't happen in a vacuum. It creates enemies, powerful ones. And one of them, I discovered with a chilling sense of inevitability, was a man named Alastair Finch, CEO of Finch Global, a sprawling conglomerate with fingers in every pie, and a direct competitor to several of Mia Vision's newer, more ambitious ventures. Alastair Finch, a familiar name, but why? Then it hit me. Sterling and Finch, the internship, Professor Wilson's daughter, and Alastair Finch was Professor Eleanor Wilson's husband. The connection slammed into me, a missing piece of a puzzle I hadn't even realized I was assembling. Suddenly, Wilson's bias against me, her cold dismissal, her willingness to destroy a young student's future took on a new, more sinister dimension. It wasn't just about maternal ambition, about clearing a path for her daughter Clara. It was potentially influenced by him, by his world, where competition was ruthless and Any perceived threat, however small, was to be neutralized. Had he seen me as a threat even back then? A bright, ambitious girl from the wrong side of the tracks, aiming for an internship at a company connected to his sphere of influence? A growing suspicion began to coil in my gut. There might have been more to my failing grade than simple spite or nepotism. Much more. Had Wilson's husband whispered in her ear? Had my scholarship, my potential, been a blip on his corporate radar, something to be casually swatted away? The thought made my blood run cold. My failure hadn't just been personal. It could have been a calculated move in a much larger game. A game I hadn't even known I was a pawn in. The Wilsons. They were a unit. A powerful, well-connected couple, moving through the world with the casual entitlement of those who believe the rules don't apply to them. My resolve hardened. This wasn't just about Professor Wilson anymore. It was about her husband, too. It was about the system that allowed people like them to flourish, to crush others without consequence. The game was bigger, more complex than I'd initially thought, and the stakes were higher. But so was my determination. The suspicion that Alistair Finch, Professor Wilson's husband, might have played a role in my downfall gnawed at me. It was one thing to be failed by a bitter academic playing favorites. It was another entirely to be a casualty of corporate maneuvering. I needed answers, not just for my own peace of mind, but to understand the full scope of what I was up against. I hired a private investigator, a discreet firm known for its thoroughness and its ability to dig where others couldn't. I want you to look into Professor Eleanor Wilson at Westlake University, I instructed Mr. Davies, a man whose bland appearance belied a razor-sharp mind. Her academic record, her grading patterns, any irregularities, and her husband, Alistair Finch. His connections to the university, specifically. Weeks later, Davies delivered his report. It was thicker than I expected and far more damning. Professor Wilson, it turned out, had a discernible pattern. Over the years, a statistically significant number of promising female students, particularly those who showed ambition in fields where her daughter Clara might perceive competition, or who applied for the same limited scholarships or internships, had received inexplicably poor grades in Wilson's classes. Bright, hardworking students, their academic trajectories suddenly, inexplicably derailed. Many had lost scholarships, many had dropped out. Their stories were chillingly familiar. Mine was not an isolated incident. It was part of a quiet, insidious campaign. The report detailed instances of academic impropriety, lost exam papers, subjective grading on essays that conveniently disadvantaged certain students, a network of old friends in the administration who ensured any complaints were quietly buried. It was a rotten system, protecting its own. And then there was the Finch connection. Alistair Finch's company, Finch Global, had donated millions to Westlake University over the years. Significant seven-figure donations, often earmarked for the economics department or for new buildings that bore the Finch family name. He was a major benefactor, a man the university administration would be loath to displease. His influence was palpable, even if not explicitly stated in board meeting minutes. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together, forming a grim, ugly picture. My first life failure wasn't just about Professor Wilson's personal vendetta or her husband's casual cruelty. It was symptomatic of a larger, corrupt system where money and influence bought silence, bought compliance, bought the destruction of inconvenient lives. Westlake University, the prestigious institution I had once revered, was deeply compromised. A cold anger settled in my chest, different from the hot, personal rage I'd felt as a teenager. This was bigger. My motivation began to evolve. Personal revenge still simmered, a low, constant flame. But now, it was intertwined with a desire for systemic justice. It wasn't enough to make Wilson pay. It wasn't even enough to make Finch pay. I had to dismantle the system that enabled them, that protected them, that allowed them to prey on vulnerable students. My plan to buy Westlake, once a grand, almost fantastical scheme fueled by a desire for personal retribution, now felt like a moral imperative. I wouldn't just own Professor Wilson's career. I would cleanse the rot from the foundations of the institution itself. The fight was no longer just mine. It was for every student whose dreams had been casually extinguished by the Wilsons and the corrupt system that sheltered them. The scale of my ambition grew, fueled by a righteous fury. I would not just rise, I would reform. I would not just conquer, I would cleanse. The investigation had armed me with knowledge, and knowledge in my hands was power, the kind of power that could bring empires, both academic and corporate, to their knees. 15 years, an eternity, and yet it felt like yesterday when I'd last walked these hallowed, now tainted halls. I was 33, a billionaire CEO, a name that commanded respect and sometimes fear in boardrooms across the globe. And I was also Amy Chang, a transfer student with a deliberately average transcript from a nondescript out-of-state college, enrolling in Westlake University's advanced economics class. The irony was delicious. Professor Eleanor Wilson was still there, of course. Now department chair, a doyen of the economics faculty, her silver hair perhaps a little thinner, the lines around her eyes a little deeper, but that same aura of icy superiority clung to her like expensive, stale perfume. She was approaching retirement age, or so the university grapevine, which I now had discreet access to, suggested. Perfect timing. My appearance was different. Gone was the perpetually exhausted, poorly dressed scholarship kid. Amy Chang was polished, if unremarkable. Tasteful, slightly boring clothes, hair styled to be neat, forgettable. I wore glasses I didn't need. I slouched just a little. I made sure to look down when faculty members passed, a picture of mild insecurity. In class, I was a study in calculated mediocrity, with flashes of brilliance I knew would be both undeniable and unsettling to someone like Wilson. My papers were meticulously researched, articulately argued, hitting every rubric point with unerring accuracy. They were, objectively, A-grade work. But I adopted mannerisms in class that I knew, from my first life experience and Davies's report, would trigger her biases. I'd hesitate before speaking, even when I knew the answer cold. I'd ask too many clarifying questions, feigning a slight obtuseness. I'd dress just a little too eagerly for presentations. A subtle hint of a striver, someone trying too hard. I watched her, a predator observing its prey, though in this scenario, the roles were about to be spectacularly reversed. It was fascinating, in a detached, clinical way, to see her prejudice emerge just as before. The slight frown when Amy Chang raised her hand, the way her gaze would skim over me dismissively, the almost imperceptible sigh when I asked a question she deemed too basic, despite its underlying complexity which she consistently failed to grasp from Amy. She didn't recognize me, of course, why would she? The Mia Chen she had destroyed was a ghost, a footnote in her long career of casual cruelties. I was just another face in the lecture hall, another student to be sorted, judged, and, if I played my part correctly, dismissed. The old anger was still there, a cold ember in my chest, but it was overlaid with a chilling patience. This wasn't about an emotional outburst, about confronting her with the past. This was about gathering fresh evidence. This was about proving, incontrovertibly, that her biases were not a thing of the past, but an active, ongoing pattern. The game was afoot, and this time I was setting the rules. I knew her playbook, and I was about to write a new chapter, one she would not enjoy. The semester progressed, a slow, deliberate dance. I submitted my assignments, each one a carefully crafted piece of academic excellence disguised in Amy Chang's unassuming packaging. I participated in class, always polite, always slightly hesitant, always allowing that flicker of what Wilson would perceive as insecurity to show. I saw the familiar patterns in her interactions, not just with me, but with other female students who showed too much spark, too much ambition. The subtle put-downs, the backhanded compliments, the grades that were consistently just a little lower than their male counterparts for comparable work. Then came the final exam. Again. I walked into the hall, a strange sense of déjà vu washing over me. This time, however, there was no fear, no desperate hope. Only a cold, calculating resolve. I wrote the exam, my answers even more thorough, more insightful than they had been 15 years prior. I had the benefit of an additional 15 years of real-world economic experience, after all, even if it was a secret. The result was predictable, an F again. Professor Wilson had actually outdone herself this time. Perhaps Amy Chang's intermittent flashes of insight had irritated her even more than young Mia Chen's quiet diligence. But this time, things were different. I wasn't a naive, heartbroken 18-year-old. I was prepared. Before the grade was officially posted during a seemingly innocuous office hours visit to discuss my progress, I had engaged Professor Wilson in a conversation about my performance, about my final paper, about my understanding of the course material. My purse, sitting innocently on the chair beside me, contained a tiny state-of-the-art recording device. "Professor Wilson," I said, my voice as Amy Chang, tinged with a carefully calibrated disappointment. "I just received my grade. An F. I I truly don't understand. I felt I had a strong grasp of the concepts. My final paper." She gave me that same dismissive wave of the hand, that same condescending look. "Miss Chang, as I've told others, not everyone is suited for the intellectual demands of this department. Your work, while occasionally showing glimmers, ultimately lacked the depth and rigor required. Could you perhaps point to specific areas in my final exam or my major paper where I fell short?" I pressed, my tone respectful yet persistent. "I'm truly eager to learn from my mistakes." Her eyes narrowed. "I don't have time to relitigate every grade, Miss Chang. The assessment stands. Perhaps a different field of study would be more appropriate for your talents." The unspoken insult hung in the air. This time, I didn't beg. I didn't crumble. I met her gaze, a flicker of something steely momentarily replacing Amy Chang's usual timidity. "Professor Wilson, I believe my work was exemplary. I believe this grade is not a reflection of my academic merit, but perhaps of something else." She scoffed, a harsh, derisive sound. "And what would that be, Miss Chang? Are you accusing me of incompetence? Or bias?" She leaned forward, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Do whatever you want. Make any accusation you please. No one will believe a student over me. I am the department chair." I allowed a small, knowing smile to touch Amy Chang's lips. "Actually," I said, my voice dropping slightly, losing its feigned hesitancy. I reached into my purse and retrieved the tiny recording device, holding it up for her to see. "They might, especially when they hear this." The color drained from Professor Wilson's face. For the first time, I saw not icy superiority, but a flicker of genuine shock, perhaps even fear. "And for the record, Professor," I added, letting a fraction of my true self, Mia Chen, bleed through. "My final paper was on the isometrical market effects of regulatory capture in emerging economies, a topic, I believe, quite a few Nobel laureates are still grappling with. Perhaps the depth was there, but the reader lacked the capacity to see it." I stood up, leaving the recording device on her pristine desk. "I'll be filing a formal complaint with the university, Professor, with supporting evidence." I walked out, leaving her speechless, staring at the tiny piece of technology that held the first nail for her professional coffin. This failure felt very, very different. It felt like victory. The formal complaint, filed under the name Amy Chang, landed on the dean's desk with a polite but firm thud, accompanied by a transcript of the recording and copies of my exemplary coursework, which I knew would stand up to any impartial scrutiny. The university, as per protocol, initiated an investigation, or rather, what they called an investigation. It was, from the outset, a half-hearted affair. A junior faculty member, looking perpetually stressed and overworked, was assigned to my case. He interviewed me, his questions vague, his note-taking sporadic. He interviewed Professor Wilson, who, I later learned through my own channels, presented herself as the aggrieved party, a senior academic being harassed by a disgruntled, underperforming student. The whispers started almost immediately. Pressure, from on high. Alistair Finch's name wasn't mentioned officially, of course not, but his shadow loomed large. Donations, endowments, the new Finch wing of the business school, these things spoke louder than any formal complaint from a Miss Chang. I, still in my guise as Amy, watched the charade unfold with a sense of grim satisfaction. This was exactly what I'd expected. The system trying to protect itself, trying to protect one of its own, especially one so well connected. The university administration was caught between a rock and a hard place, a student with compelling recorded evidence of potential bias, and a powerful benefactor whose displeasure could have significant financial repercussions. Their loyalty, predictably, leaned towards the money. Weeks turned into a month. The investigation dragged its feet. I received polite, noncommittal updates. We are looking into the matter thoroughly, Miss Chang. These things take time. Finally, the Dean of Arts and Sciences, a man named Dr. Albright, summoned me to his office. He had a kindly, apologetic air that I knew was entirely for show. Miss Chang, he began, steepling his fingers on his large oak desk, his expression a carefully crafted mask of paternal concern. We have reviewed your complaint and Professor Wilson's response, and while we appreciate you bringing your concerns to our attention, he paused, sighing theatrically. The committee has found insufficient evidence to formally censure Professor Wilson. I raised an eyebrow. Insufficient evidence? Despite the recording? Despite the clear disparity between the quality of my work and the grade received? Dr. Albright shifted uncomfortably. Professor Wilson is a long-standing, respected member of our faculty, Miss Chang. Her academic judgment is generally considered sound. There can be subjective elements in grading, as you know. And her comments on the recording, Dean? Her dismissive attitude? Her suggestion that I am not suited for academia? He winced. Perhaps unfortunate phrasing, but not conclusive proof of actionable bias. Miss Chang, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Off the record, the Wilsons, they are very influential. Mr. Finch is one of our most generous alumni. My hands are somewhat tied. I'm truly sorry, but this complaint, it's unlikely to go anywhere further. He offered a weak, sympathetic smile. Perhaps you might consider focusing on your other courses moving forward? I looked at him, a slow, understanding smile spreading across Amy Chang's face. This was perfect. Better than I could have hoped. He thought he was dismissing a powerless student. He had no idea he was talking to the woman who was about to own his entire institution. That's exactly what I needed to hear, Dean Albright, I said, my voice surprisingly cheerful. Thank you for your candor. You've been most illuminating. He looked a little surprised by my upbeat reaction to having my case torpedoed. I stood up, the picture of a student who had accepted her fate. But as I walked out of his office, Mia Chen was practically purring. His admission, his confirmation of the systemic rot, of the power the Wilsons wielded through their money, it was the final piece of justification I needed for what was coming next. My hands weren't tied. In fact, they were about to sign some very large checks. Dean Albright's confirmation was the green light. The time for subtle maneuvering as Amy Chang was over. The time for Mia Chen, CEO of Mia Vision Enterprises, to make her move had arrived. Westlake University was about to get a new benefactor, whether it knew it yet or not. Acquiring a controlling interest in a university like Westlake wasn't simple. It was a complex beast, part private, part public, with a labyrinthine financial structure, an entrenched board of trustees, and a proud, centuries-old history. But I had two things on my side: vast resources and my intricate knowledge of future financial landscapes, which also gave me an uncanny understanding of present-day loopholes and opportunities. Through a series of carefully constructed shell companies, each one layered to obscure the ultimate source of the funds, Mia Vision began its quiet campaign. It started with strategic purchases of university bonds, then moved to acquiring stakes in private foundations that held significant influence over Westlake's endowment. My financial teams, the best in the business, worked around the clock, their actions precise, untraceable back to me directly. Westlake, as it happened, was facing a period of financial turbulence. Mismanagement in previous years, coupled with a decline in federal funding and a couple of ill-advised investment decisions by the current board, had left the university surprisingly vulnerable. They were actively seeking a white knight, a major donor to shore up their flagging finances. They just didn't know their white knight was about to become their new owner. My offer, when it finally came through an anonymous intermediary, was substantial. A massive multi-billion-dollar donation, enough to not only rescue the institution from its current woes, but to secure its financial future for decades to come. It was an offer they couldn't refuse. But it came with conditions, stringent, non-negotiable conditions. A restructuring of the board of trustees, significant oversight rights for the benefactor's representatives, the power to appoint key administrative positions, including the university president and the deans. Essentially, control. The existing board hemmed and hawed. They balked at the conditions. The idea of an unknown entity wielding so much power was unsettling, but the financial reality was stark. Without this injection of capital, Westlake faced drastic cuts, a loss of prestige, perhaps even insolvency down the line. The negotiations were tense, conducted through layers of lawyers and financial advisors. I remained in the shadows, an enigmatic puppeteer pulling the strings. The board, desperate and feeling the pressure from faculty and alumni who were catching wind of the university's precarious situation, finally caved. They voted reluctantly to accept the terms of the anonymous benefactor. They were saving Westlake, they told themselves. They had no idea they were handing it over. The ink dried on the contracts. Westlake University, the institution that had chewed me up and spat me out, was now, for all intents and purposes, mine. Phase 1 of the ultimate plan was complete. A quiet satisfaction settled over me. It wasn't the fiery triumph I might have imagined as a vengeful teenager. It was colder, more profound. The power I now held was immense, and I intended to use every ounce of it. A university-wide assembly was called. The email invitation was vague. An important announcement regarding the future leadership and direction of Westlake University. The grand auditorium, the same one where I'd sat through countless orientation speeches and guest lectures in my first life, buzzed with speculation. Faculty, students, administrative staff, everyone was there, a sea of anxious and curious faces. I spotted Professor Eleanor Wilson in the audience, seated in the reserved section for department chairs. She looked confident, almost smug. No doubt she believed her position, her influence, was secure. She probably imagined this assembly was to announce some new research grant she'd championed, or perhaps a new building named after a crony. She adjusted her silk scarf, a picture of academic authority. Little did she know. The current university president, a man named Dr. Sterling, no relation to the internship, ironically, though the name always sent a shiver down my spine, walked to the podium. He looked pale and stressed. He stammered through a brief, uncomfortable speech about challenges, opportunities, and the need for bold new visions. Then, he came to the crux of it. "And so," he said, his voice barely a croak, "it is with a mixture of emotions that the Board of Trustees announces a significant restructuring made possible by the extraordinary generosity of a new benefactor who has secured the university's financial future. This benefactor's commitment to Westlake is unparalleled, and with it comes a new governance structure. As part of this transition, I will be stepping down as president, effective immediately." A shocked murmur rippled through the auditorium. Sterling stepping down? This was big. "And now," Dr. Sterling continued, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else but on that stage, "I would like to introduce the new chairperson of the Westlake University Board of Trustees, who will be guiding our institution into this new era." He gestured towards the side of the stage, and I walked out, not as Amy Chang, the timid transfer student, but as Mia Chen, CEO of Mia Vision Enterprises. Dressed in a sharply tailored power suit, my heels clicking decisively on the polished stage. The transformation was complete. A wave of stunned silence washed over the auditorium, followed by a cacophony of gasps, whispers, and the frantic clicking of cell phone cameras as people tried to place my face, to connect the dots. I saw Professor Wilson's face. Her jaw literally dropped. The color drained from her cheeks, replaced by a ghostly pallor. Her eyes, those cold, dismissive eyes, widened in stunned disbelief. Recognition finally dawned. The mousy Amy Chang was gone. In her place stood the ghost of a student she had destroyed, now resurrected as the most powerful person at the university. Her smug confidence shattered, replaced by a raw, naked shock. I reached the podium, my gaze sweeping across the stunned faces, lingering for a moment on Wilson. I allowed a small, cool smile to play on my lips. "Good morning," I said, my voice calm, resonant, amplified by the microphone. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mia Chen, and as of this morning, I am the new chairperson of the Board of Trustees of Westlake University." I let that sink in. "Westlake has a long and proud history," I continued, my tone even. professional, but with an underlying current of steel. But tradition must also be accompanied by integrity, by fairness, by a commitment to true meritocracy. Under my leadership, this university will undergo a thorough review of its practices and its principles. I looked directly at Wilson. Effective immediately, we will be launching a university-wide audit of all grading practices, tenure review processes, and grievance procedures. We will be establishing a new independent ethics committee with full power to investigate any and all allegations of misconduct, bias, or academic impropriety, past or present. No one will be above scrutiny. The implication was crystal clear. Westlake University, I concluded, my voice ringing with authority, will now stand for meritocracy, not aristocracy. It will be a place where talent is nurtured, not crushed, where fairness prevails, not favoritism. This is a new era for Westlake, and the work begins today. The silence that followed was profound, charged with 1,000 unspoken questions and a palpable sense of a world irrevocably shifted on its axis. Professor Wilson looked like she was about to faint. The game had changed, and I was now holding all the cards. It didn't take long. Later that afternoon, my new, rather opulent office, the former president's office, which I'd had redecorated in a style that was minimalist, modern, and unapologetically powerful, received a visitor, Professor Eleanor Wilson. She didn't knock. She practically stormed in, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. The icy composure was gone, replaced by a raw, ragged emotion I'd never seen in her before. "You!" she hissed, her voice trembling. "Mia Chen, it was you. That Amy Cheng charade." I leaned back in my large leather chair, regarding her coolly. "Professor Wilson, or should I say Eleanor, please have a seat, though I imagine you won't be comfortable for long." She ignored the invitation, pacing in front of my desk like a caged animal. "How could you? All this elaborate scheme to buy the university just for revenge?" "Revenge is a strong word, Eleanor," I said, my voice soft, yet carrying an unmistakable edge. "I prefer to think of it as course correction, accountability." Suddenly, her demeanor shifted. The anger faltered, replaced by a desperate, wheedling tone. "Mia, listen to me. What happened all those years ago? I remember you. A bright girl. Perhaps I was harsh, too demanding." "Harsh?" I raised an eyebrow. "You failed me, Eleanor. You destroyed my scholarship, my future, with a stroke of your red pen. You dismissed me like I was nothing. Was that just being harsh?" "I was trying to toughen you up," she exclaimed, her voice rising again, a note of hysteria creeping in. "The real world is a difficult place. I thought I was preparing you." I almost laughed. The audacity. Preparing me? By ensuring your daughter got an internship I was more qualified for? By contributing to a system that allowed you to systematically crush other ambitious young women who might have outshone dear Clara? I gestured to a sleek tablet on my desk. With a tap, a holographic display shimmered into existence between us, showing a meticulously organized file. Davies' report. My own investigation's findings. Names, dates, testimonies. A pattern of abuse of power that spanned decades. "This," I said, my voice like ice, "is not toughening students up, Eleanor. This is a systematic abuse of your position. This is corruption." Her face went ashen as she scanned the damning evidence. The fight seemed to drain out of her. She sank into one of the chairs, her shoulders slumped. What do you want?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I want justice," I said simply. "I'm offering you a choice. Option 1. You tender your immediate resignation from Westlake University. Quietly, discreetly. You can cite personal reasons, health, a desire to spend more time with your garden. Whatever you like. In return, you'll receive a standard retirement package. No golden parachute, but enough to live comfortably. And this investigation," I gestured to the holographic display, "remains confidential." "And option 2? She asked, her eyes filled with a dawning dread. "Option 2, I said, my voice hardening, "is a full public investigation by the new ethics committee. All of this," another gesture to the display, "becomes public record. Your tenure will be revoked. Your reputation, and by extension your husband's, will be in tatters. You will likely face legal action from former students. And your retirement package will be considerably less generous, assuming you're not in prison. Just then, the door to my office burst open again. Alistair Finch, Professor Wilson's husband. He looked like a thundercloud, his face florid with rage. He'd clearly been informed of my new position. "What is the meaning of this, Chen?" he boomed, striding towards my desk, his expensive suit doing little to hide the brutish power in his frame. "Harassing my wife? Threatening her? Do you have any idea who I am? I will destroy you. I will destroy Maya Vision. I will drag your name through the mud until you—" I held up a hand, a calm, almost bored gesture that seemed to momentarily stun him into silence. "Mr. Finch," I said, my voice polite, yet infused with a chilling certainty, "before you make any more threats you can't possibly carry out, there's something you should know." I paused, letting the moment hang. As of 9 a.m. this morning, Mia Vision Enterprises completed its acquisition of a controlling interest in Finch Global. His jaw, much like his wife's earlier, dropped. The bluster, the rage, evaporated, replaced by a look of utter, uncomprehending shock. I leaned forward, a predatory smile playing on my lips. "So, you see, Alistair, you can't destroy me. You can't destroy Mia Vision. Because actually, as of this morning, I'm your boss as well." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Eleanor Wilson's quiet, ragged sob. Checkmate. The look on Alistair Finch's face, that potent mix of disbelief, fury, and dawning impotence, was a victory in itself. Eleanor Wilson just sat there, a broken woman. For a moment, a fierce, vindictive satisfaction surged through me. This was it, the culmination of 20 years of planning, of striving, of burning resentment. I had them, both of them. I could crush them, just as they had once tried to crush me. But as I looked at Eleanor's slumped figure, something unexpected flickered within me. Not pity, not yet, but a disquiet. I saw my own face reflected in her despair. The face I might have worn permanently if I hadn't been given this second chance, if bitterness had been my only companion. Flashbacks assailed me. The cold water of the river, the despair, the darkness, the utter hopelessness that had driven me to the university bridge. Was this what I wanted? To inflict that same level underscore of despair on someone else, even someone who deserved it? To become the thing I hated? My gaze drifted to a small, framed photo on my new desk. A picture of my parents, their faces beaming with pride at my Mia Vision latest philanthropic award. They had sacrificed so much for me, not so I could become a purveyor of misery, but so I could build something better. In the days following the confrontation, I found myself walking the Westlake campus, not as Amy Chang, but as myself, Mia Chen, the new chairperson. Students would stop and stare, whispering. Some looked intimidated, others hopeful. I started talking to them, really talking. I heard stories of financial struggles, of biased professors. Wilson wasn't the only one, though perhaps the most egregious. Of dreams teetering on the brink. I began mentoring a young woman, a brilliant engineering student named Sarah, who reminded me so much of my younger self. She was on a scholarship, working 2 jobs, her talent undeniable but her confidence fragile, worn down by a dismissive department head who clearly favored the male students. Helping her, seeing the spark of hope reignite in her eyes, felt good. More fulfilling than the cold satisfaction of Wilson's and Finch's downfall. The choice before me was no longer simple. Complete destruction of Eleanor Wilson might feel good in the short term, a cathartic release of decades of pent-up anger. But what then? Would it truly change anything? Or would it just make me another tyrant, another abuser of power? A new plan began to form, one that still held Wilson accountable but offered a different path. A path that focused on repair, on making amends, not just on punishment. It was a riskier path, one that might not satisfy the deepest, darkest parts of my desire for vengeance. But it felt righter. More aligned with the woman I wanted to be in this second life, not just the woman I had been forced to become. The power I held was a tool. I could use it as a hammer to smash. Or I could use it as a sculptor's chisel to reshape, to refine, to create something better from the flawed material of the past. The choice was mine, and it would define not just Wilson's future, but my own. A week later, I summoned Eleanor Wilson to my office again. Not Alistair this time, just her. She entered hesitantly, a stark contrast to her previous furious intrusion. She looked older, smaller, the fight completely gone from her. She sat in the chair I indicated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor. Eleanor, I began, my voice calm, devoid of the triumph or anger from our last meeting. I've had some time to think about you, about Westlake, about everything. She finally looked up, her eyes wary, expecting the final blow. I'm still offering you a retirement package, I said, but I've revised the terms. I slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. She picked it up with trembling fingers. There are two options, I explained. Option 1. You resign immediately. You will receive a generous retirement package, including full pension and healthcare benefits. However, it comes with a condition. For the next 5 years, you will be required to work on a part-time salaried basis as an advisor and mentor for a new scholarship program I am establishing, the Second Chance Scholarship, I'm calling it. It will be for disadvantaged students, students who show exceptional promise but face significant financial or systemic obstacles. Your role will be to guide them, to help them navigate the university, to ensure they receive the support they need to succeed. You will report directly to a committee I appoint. Her eyes scanned the paper, a flicker of disbelief in their depths. Option 2, I continued, is much simpler. You resign immediately. You receive a basic retirement package, the legal minimum. No frills, no extended benefits. You walk away quietly, and the internal investigation into your conduct is closed. Its findings sealed. You can go and live your life, and Westlake will move on. She stared at the paper, then at me, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice a hoarse whisper. Why? After everything I did to you, why would you offer me option 1? Why would you show me any mercy, any chance at anything other than disgrace? I leaned back in my chair, meeting her gaze steadily. Because, Eleanor, this isn't really about you anymore. Not entirely. It's about those students. It's about making sure no one else at Westlake University ever experiences what I did. What countless others did because of people like you, and the system that protected you. I paused, letting the words sink in. Option 2 lets you disappear. Option 1. Option 1 gives you a chance, however small, to contribute to a solution. To perhaps, in some tiny way, make amends, not to me, but to the future students of this university. You think I can be redeemed? She asked, a bitter laugh escaping her. You think 5 years of charity work can undo decades of what I became? Frankly, Eleanor, I said, my voice neutral, I don't know if you can be redeemed. And to be honest, your personal redemption isn't my primary concern. My concern is the students. My concern is Westlake. This offer isn't about forgiveness. It's about utility. It's about whether you can still be useful in a constructive way or whether you are simply a problem to be managed and removed. The choice was stark. Dignity and purpose, albeit under my strict supervision, or a quiet, ignominious exit. She looked down at the paper again, her shoulders shaking. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of the city. The decision she made now would set the course for the remainder of her life. And, in a strange way, it would also be a test of whether there was anything left within her worth salvaging. Eleanor Wilson sat there for a long time, the paper trembling in her hand. I waited patiently. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with unspoken history and the weight of her decision. Finally, she looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. Not with anger this time, but with a raw, desolate pain that seemed to come from a place deep within her. You want to know why I did it? She whispered, her voice cracking. Why I became that person? The one who smirked while destroying a student's life? I didn't respond, just watched her, waiting. This wasn't part of my plan, this unprompted confession. A shudder ran through her. Decades ago, she began, her gaze distant, fixed on some painful memory. I was a student, much like you, Mia, bright, ambitious, full of dreams. I was at a prestigious university, not unlike Westlake. I had a professor, a man, powerful, respected. He he saw my potential, or so I thought. Her voice grew fainter. He took an interest in me, offered me a research assistant position. Mentorship, he called it. But it wasn't mentorship he wanted. He wanted more. And when I refused, when I threatened to expose him, she choked on a sob. He destroyed me, my academic career, my reputation. He failed me, publicly humiliated me, spread rumors. No one believed me. He was a titan. I was just a girl. The story poured out of her, disjointed, painful. How she'd been forced to leave that university, her dreams in tatters. How she'd clawed her way back, slowly, painfully, into academia, ending up at Westlake. But something inside her had broken. The bitterness, the resentment, had taken root, festering over the years. I swore I would never be that vulnerable again, she continued, tears streaming down her face now. I swore I would be the one with the power. I told myself I was being strong, that I was weeding out the weak. But I became him. I became the thing I hated most in the world. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a self-loathing that was almost terrifying to witness. Every time I saw a bright young woman, someone like you were, someone like I had been, it was like looking in a mirror at everything I had lost, and I hated it. So I lashed out. I crushed them. Because if I couldn't have my dream, why should they? It wasn't a justification. Nothing could justify what she'd done to me, to others, but it was context. A horrifying, twisted explanation for the cruelty that had defined her. She had been a victim, and in her pain, she had become a perpetrator, perpetuating the very cycle of abuse that had destroyed her own youth. A chill ran down my spine. In her cautionary tale, I saw a dark reflection, a possible future version of myself if I let revenge consume me entirely. If I used my power only to punish, to inflict pain, without a thought for repair or redemption, would I too become warped by bitterness, defined by my wounds, eventually turning into the very thing I fought against? Eleanor Wilson was not asking for pity or forgiveness. She was simply unburdening herself, laying bare the rotten core of her motivations. She finally fell silent. Her shoulders slumped, her face buried in her hands. The confession hung in the air, heavy and raw. After a long moment, she lifted her head, her eyes meeting mine. They were still filled with pain, but also with a sliver of something else. Resignation? A desperate, flickering ember of hope? Option 1, she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet firm. I'll do it. The scholarship program, if you'll still have me. I looked at her, this broken woman, this architect of my past misery, now offering herself up for a chance at something. Not redemption in my eyes, perhaps not even in her own, but a chance to do something other than cause harm. The path ahead was uncertain, but her choice, this unexpected, agonizing confession, had shifted something. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to this second life than just settling old scores. Perhaps there was room for a different kind of justice, a more complicated and ultimately a more meaningful one. Eleanor Wilson choosing option 1 was unexpected. I had braced myself for her to take the easier way out, to vanish into a quiet, if disgraced, retirement. Her decision to stay, to subject herself to working under my direction for a cause born from her own misdeeds, spoke of something I hadn't anticipated, a flicker, however faint, of a desire for atonement. Or perhaps just a desperate clinging to relevance. Either way, it served my purpose. The implementation of university-wide reforms began immediately. My new ethics committee, staffed with impartial academics and legal experts from outside Westlake, started its work with a mandate for transparency and rigor. The audit of grading practices sent ripples of unease through certain departments. Tenured professors, long accustomed to ruling their classrooms like fiefdoms, suddenly found their methods under scrutiny. It wasn't a witch hunt, but it was a clear message. The old ways were over. The Second Chance Scholarship was established, named not after me, but after my parents, the Chen Family Scholarship. It felt right. Their sacrifices had, in a way, funded this entire endeavor, this second life. The program was designed to support students who, like the younger Mia, possessed talent and ambition, but lacked resources or faced systemic barriers. Eleanor Wilson began her work with the scholarship students. Reluctantly, under the close supervision of Dr. Anya Sharma, a dynamic young sociologist I'd appointed to oversee the program, a woman whose commitment to social justice was unwavering. Wilson's initial interactions were strained. She was curt, her old habits of condescension flaring up. The students were wary of her, knowing her reputation, even if they didn't know the full story of her connection to me or the program's genesis. I received weekly reports from Dr. Sharma. Professor Wilson is adapting, one report read. She still defaults to criticism, but yesterday I overheard her giving genuinely constructive advice to a young woman struggling with her thesis proposal. It was surprising. I watched from a distance, skeptical but also curious. Could a person truly change so late in life, after decades of ingrained bitterness? Or was this just an act, a performance for my benefit? Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something seemed to shift in Eleanor Wilson. The students in the scholarship program were not the entitled, well-connected undergraduates she was used to dismissing. They were hungry, grateful for the opportunity, their potential shining brightly despite the hardships they'd faced. They were resilient. They reminded her perhaps not of the victim she had been, but of the fighter she had failed to remain. Dr. Sharma noted that Wilson started spending more time with the students, not just in formal advisory sessions, but listening to their stories, offering insights that went beyond academic critique. She was still difficult, still prickly. Her default setting was not warmth. But there were moments. A grudging word of praise, a pointed question that pushed a student to think deeper. A rare, almost imperceptible softening around her eyes when a student had a breakthrough. One afternoon, I was walking through the library, a place I still felt a strange mix of trauma and triumph in. And I saw her, Eleanor Wilson, sitting at a table with a young scholarship student, a girl from a rough inner-city neighborhood. They were hunched over a laptop, discussing something with an intensity that was purely academic. For a moment, Wilson looked up, and her eyes met mine across the crowded room. There was no fear in her gaze this time, no anger, just a kind of weary acknowledgement. And then she turned back to the student. The transformation, if it was indeed happening, was not for me. It was for them. And perhaps for herself. I remained skeptical. The wounds she had inflicted were too deep for easy forgiveness or forgetfulness. But I was also a pragmatist. If her forced atonement was genuinely helping these students, then the program was working, regardless of the state of her soul. Westlake was changing. I was changing it. And in the process, perhaps even its most notorious figures were, in their own halting, imperfect ways, being changed too. Hope was a dangerous thing, I knew. But as I watched Eleanor Wilson, the architect of my first life's downfall, now playing a small part in building new futures, a tiny, cautious flicker of it began to glow within me. 5 years. 5 years since I'd walked onto that stage and turned Westlake University on its head. 5 years since Eleanor Wilson had reluctantly begun her penance. The university was a different place now. The reforms I'd implemented had taken root, spreading like healthy vines through the old, crumbling structures of bias and complacency. The Chen Family Scholarship was thriving, a beacon of hope for students who would have once been invisible. My work hadn't stopped at Westlake's gates. Mia Vision Enterprises had established a national foundation dedicated to combating academic bias and promoting true meritocracy in higher education. We funded research, supported whistleblower initiatives, and worked with other universities willing to undertake the difficult, necessary work of reform. It was a slow, challenging process, but the needle was moving. Eleanor Wilson had become an institution within the scholarship program. Still a difficult personality, prone to sharp critiques, and an almost allergic reaction to sentimentality. But her dedication to the students was undeniable. She fought for them, championed their causes within the university bureaucracy with a ferocity I recognized. She knew the system, its weak points, its levers of power, and she used that knowledge now not to crush, but to clear paths. Dr. Sharma often joked that Wilson was more effective as a student advocate than many of the well-meaning but less formidable faculty members. Our interactions were infrequent, professional. A cautious, wary respect had developed between us. She never apologized for what she'd done to me in my first life, not in words. But her actions, her unwavering commitment to the scholarship students, were a form of living amends, perhaps the only kind she was capable of. I accepted it for what it was. Alistair Finch had faded into obscurity. After I'd taken over Finch Global, I'd systematically dismantled his toxic corporate culture, restructured the company, and eventually sold off its less savory divisions. He'd retired, a wealthy but broken man, his reputation tarnished by the quiet but persistent rumors that always follow a fall from grace. He and Eleanor were still married, I heard, though they lived largely separate lives. His comeuppance had been swift, brutal, and ultimately less satisfying than I'd imagined. It was her slow, arduous journey that held my attention. I was 38 now, the same age as the Mia Chen who had stood on that stage, ready to sign Professor Wilson's retirement papers in my opening gambit. The irony wasn't lost on me. My life was full, demanding. Mia Vision was a global powerhouse. The foundation was making a real difference. I had friends, a life beyond work, though romance still felt complicated. The shadows of my past, both lives, were long. Sometimes late at night, alone in my penthouse apartment overlooking the glittering city, I would think about that 18-year-old girl on the bridge, about the despair that had consumed her, and I would wonder if she would recognize the woman I had become. A woman who had wielded immense power, not just for revenge, but for something more. Something that, on my better days, felt like progress, like healing. It was during a rare, quiet weekend, while decluttering my old apartment, the one I'd lived in for years before Mia Vision truly exploded and I moved to the penthouse, that I found it. Tucked away in the back of a dusty closet, in a box I hadn't opened in over a decade of this second life, an old, worn journal. My journal, from my first life. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't even realized I still had it. My hands trembled as I opened the faded cover. The handwriting was mine, yet belonged to a girl I barely recognized. A girl consumed by a pain so raw, so overwhelming, it felt like a physical blow even now, 20 years removed. The entries chronicled the days and weeks after Professor Wilson had failed me. The loss of the scholarship, the betrayal by Chloe, the crushing weight of disappointing my parents, the slide into depression. Each page was a cry of despair, a testament to the utter hopelessness that had enveloped me. No one understands, no one sees, I'm drowning and no one even notices. What's the point anymore? I'm a failure, less ambitious, that's what she said. Maybe she's right. The bridge, it calls to me, just peace, that's all I want. Reading those words, written by my own hand in a life I had almost forgotten, was like plunging back into that icy water. The depth of that despair, the sheer unadulterated agony of that young Mia. It was horrifying. I saw how close I had come. Not just to death, but to becoming like Eleanor Wilson herself. Defined by bitterness. Consumed by resentment. Letting one act of cruelty, one failure, poison everything. If I hadn't been given this second chance, if I had somehow survived that fall, but without the knowledge of the future, without the opportunity to rebuild and reclaim my power, what would I have become? Would I have eventually clawed my way up, fueled by that same toxic bitterness that had warped Eleanor? Would I have sought to inflict pain on others as a twisted form of compensation for my own? The thought was a sobering one. My rebirth, I realized with a sudden, profound clarity, wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't just about righting a personal wrong, or even about systemic justice. It was about breaking a cycle of pain, of bitterness, of power abused. Eleanor had been a victim who became a perpetrator. I had been a victim who had been given the extraordinary chance to become something else. A wave of emotion washed over me, not anger, not even sadness, but a kind of quiet understanding. The remaining vestiges of resentment towards Eleanor Wilson, the ones that still lingered in the deepest corners of my heart, began to dissolve. They felt small, insignificant in the face of this larger truth. My second chance wasn't a gift to be hoarded for myself, for my own retribution. It was a responsibility to heal not just my own wounds, but to try and prevent others from being wounded in the same way. To build not just an empire, but a better, fairer world, even if only in the small corners I could influence. I closed the journal, a sense of peace settling over me, a peace that had eluded me for 2 lifetimes. It was time to finally, truly, let go. Not to forget, but to forgive. Not for her sake, necessarily, but for mine. The auditorium at Westlake University was filled to capacity, not with the anxious tension of a forced assembly, but with the joyous, celebratory buzz of a graduation ceremony. This wasn't just any graduation. This was the first graduating class of the Chen Family Scholarship Program. 5 years of hard work, dedication, and resilience, culminating in this moment. I sat on the stage, a proud chairperson next to a panel of dignitaries. And next to me, looking remarkably composed, almost serene, was Eleanor Wilson. She was retiring, for real this time. Her 5-year commitment to the scholarship program was complete. Today was her last official day at Westlake. The student speaker, a young woman named Maria Rodriguez, one of the first scholarship recipients, took the podium. She was a brilliant orator, her voice filled with passion and gratitude. She spoke of overcoming adversity, of the doors that Westlake and the scholarship program had opened for her and her fellow graduates. "And I want to thank 2 people in particular," Maria said, her voice thick with emotion, her gaze sweeping across the stage. "Chairperson Mia Chen, whose vision and generosity made all of this possible. You didn't just give us funds, you gave us belief. You showed us that our dreams were valid, that our potential was limitless." A warm round of applause filled the auditorium. I smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. "And," Maria continued, turning slightly, "I want to thank Professor Eleanor Wilson." A different kind of murmur rippled through the crowd. Wilson's reputation, though softened by her work with the scholarship program, still carried echoes of her past. "Professor Wilson," Maria said, looking directly at her, "you pushed us. You challenged us. You never let us settle for mediocrity. You taught us rigor and resilience and the importance of fighting for our ideas. You were our toughest critic and our fiercest advocate. Thank you, Professor, for believing in us, even when you made us work incredibly hard to prove ourselves." Eleanor Wilson's composure wavered. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Maria. Later, it was Eleanor's turn to speak, her farewell address. She kept it brief, her voice surprisingly steady. She spoke of her long career at Westlake, of the changes she had seen. And then, she looked directly at me. "Sometimes," she said, her voice clear and carrying through the auditorium, "our greatest teachers are our students. They teach us humility. They teach us to see the world anew. They teach us about second chances." Her gaze held mine for a long moment. "Thank you, Mia Chen, for everything." It was as close to a direct acknowledgement of our shared, twisted history as she would ever come. And it was enough. After the ceremony, in my office, the retirement papers sat on my desk. The same kind of papers that had trembled in her hand in my imagined prologue to this second life. This time, her hand was steady as she signed them. I countersigned, a sense of profound closure washing over me. The circle was complete. "What will you do now, Eleanor?" I asked, genuinely curious. She looked out the window at the students milling about on the campus green, their futures bright and open. "Dr. Sharma has asked if I might volunteer some time with the foundation," she said, a hint of surprise still in her voice. "Reading applications. Perhaps some occasional informal mentoring, if they'll have me." I smiled. "I think they will, Eleanor, I think they will." The war was over. The battle won. But the victory felt different now. Not the sharp, metallic taste of revenge, but the quiet, resonant hum of repair. of a cycle broken, of a future for many made a little brighter. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Westlake University Bridge. I stood there, leaning against the railing, watching the students cross. They were laughing, animated, their backpacks slung casually over their shoulders, their futures stretching before them, unwritten, full of possibility. Among them, I spotted Sarah, the young engineering student I'd been mentoring. She waved, her smile bright and confident. She was on her way to a prestigious internship, one she'd earned through sheer talent and hard work, in a department now led by a fair-minded professor who valued her contributions. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the distant murmur of city life. It was peaceful here now. The ghosts of my past, the despair that had once driven me to this very spot, felt distant, almost like a story about someone else. Footsteps approached from behind. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. Eleanor Wilson came to stand beside me, her gaze also fixed on the students. She looked softer now, fully retired, the sharp edges smoothed by time and perhaps by the unexpected turn her life had taken. We stood in comfortable silence for a few moments, two women bound by a strange, complex history that spanned 2 lifetimes. "Do you ever wonder why?" Eleanor asked finally, her voice quiet, contemplative. "Why you got a second chance?" I watched a group of freshmen chase a frisbee on the lawn below, their laughter echoing in the clear air. "I used to think it was for revenge," I answered, my voice equally soft. "For a long time, that's all that drove me. To make you pay. To make everyone who had a hand in my downfall pay." I paused, taking a deep breath. "But now I think it was for repair. Repair of a life. Repair of a system. Perhaps even, in some small, unexpected way, repair of a person. Or two." Eleanor nodded slowly, her eyes still on the students. "Repair," she echoed. "Yes, I think you might be right." The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The lights of Westlake started to twinkle on, illuminating the path for a new generation. We stood there, side by side, two women who had changed each other's destinies in ways neither could have ever predicted, as the day ended and a new evening, full of its own quiet promise, began.